technologies right now, the thought is all about like what can we do with tech? What can we do with personalized education by using tech and thinking about tech as disruptive? But when we think broader about what disruption means, that it means to no longer be able to do something in the way that it has always been done, in creating a fundamental shift and change in what happens. And thinking about this in trauma responsive schools, and having that broad lens of how we see the challenging behaviors that students exhibit because of their contexts outside of schools and the stress and the challenges that they're trying to cope with. And one of the ways that we traditionally see it is to see behavioral challenges and then label those behavioral challenges as a personalized labeling about the whole student. And so that is saying we can see it as a disruptive student, a student with attention deficit disorder, or an aggressive student. And to start that shift, it's starting to see this through the lens of coping responses that may be adaptive in challenging contexts that the student has to manage and navigate outside of school, that then become maladaptive inside of schools because we have particular expectations that students will come to school with a high level of self-regulation, rather than shifting to how do we teach self-regulation. And so starting to see it differently is that seeing behavioral challenges as not a disruptive student, but a student that's having difficulty calming physiological and emotional arousal, seeing a student who we may have labeled as attention deficit disorder, with attention deficit disorder, as being preoccupied with intrusive thoughts about legitimately challenging and legitimately unsafe experiences that they're happening outside of school. They don't leave that when they get inside school, get inside the doors. Those things are still running through their minds, and that may look to us like attention deficit disorder. And seeing an aggressive student, instead of that, as a student who feels unsafe on the walk to school and unsafe while in school. And if you feel unsafe, the natural response is one of being proactively aggressive, because I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's coming at me. I feel very unsafe, so I'm always proactively aggressive. But what they're responding to is a lack of safety in their feeling. And so if we can start to see behaviors differently, then ultimately what we want you to do is to gain over time is to be able to act differently. So how do we actually educate differently in order to teach the skills that mitigate the challenges that students are facing, looking at the yellow box? So providing co-regulation through modeling emotional calm and actively teaching the skills needed for emotion regulation, for managing what would originally have been labeled as a disruptive student. These are all things that can happen in the classroom and that can happen as part of what we do as educators. Using ungraded expressive writing assignments in order to help students get out some of those intrusive thoughts, and then they're able to focus on learning. And for the bottom one, beginning class with mindfulness to reduce agitation and increase present moment feelings of safety. Again, the goal is that how do we have to fundamentally shift how we see the behaviors that students are showing up with? And then how do we fundamentally shift what we do as educators and as individuals in schools in order to equip students with the capacities in order to succeed in the structures that we've created? And so that's just a brief bit of a framing that we want you to take away for today. And then we're going to go into giving you all a bit of the information that you need to make this happen.
Thank you, Masheri. That was such a great introduction to what we're going to be doing today, and a great setup for me. So I'm Dr. Audrey Stillerman. I'm a family doctor. I'm the medical director for School Health Center programs at University of Illinois, and also affiliated with the PCC Community Wellness Center. Also a member of the Illinois ACE Response Collaborative and a founder of a center with a very long name, which I'll just tell you is BEN, but it is focused on infusing education about trauma and healing into healthcare professional training. So based on our last square, using mindfulness to start class, we're gonna use mindfulness to start this class. And so what I'd like to invite you to do so that we can feel grounded and focused and present in our bodies, I'd like to invite you, if you're able, to stand up. And to feel your feet in contact with the ground, or to feel your bottom in contact with your seat. And I'd like you to put both hands out in front of you. And you can keep eyes open, you can focus softly on a point, or you can close them, whatever you like. And so what we're going to begin to do with both of our hands is we're going to slowly open them and close them and open them and close them. Just kind of feel your hands touching each other and maybe feel the air. And continue opening and closing. And we're going to do this just a few more times. I'm not going to even talk. And then once more. And you can relax your hands for a minute, and we're going to add some breathing. And so what we're going to do is we're going to breathe in through our nose and fill our bellies, and then we're going to breathe out also through our nose, and we're going to coordinate that with our hands. So we're going to breathe in when we open our hands, and we're going to breathe out when we close our hands. So we'll try that together. Hands up in front of you. Okay, so open and in, and out and closing. And open and in, and out and closing. And why don't we do that 3 more times at our own pace. Last time. And then you can relax your arms. You can slowly open your eyes if they're closed. And you can go ahead and take a seat and be comfortable. And so that probably took us less than 2 minutes, and is something that you could use for yourself when you're taking a break or in your classroom throughout the day. That is regulating and helps people get off the ceiling or up from the basement. So I'm gonna focus a lot in this part of the presentation on the science that supports a lot of the stuff that Sherry was talking about and that we'll be discussing throughout the day. So first, here's what we're gonna have a little roadmap. So I'm going to make a bold statement and say that childhood experiences, both positive and negative, determine development, learning, behavior, health, success, and a lot more across the lifespan, really from conception all the way to the grave. We're going to look at how and why experience makes its impact. And then finally, we're going to take a short look at applying the science for transforming our lives, our schools, the world in general, and that's really what this conference is about. So first, just a content warning. When we talk about trauma, it can be triggering because many of us are either directly connected to traumatic experience or know people who have had traumatic experience. And we do this not to be voyeuristic, but really in respect for the experiences of human beings and also to guide us in terms of our practice. And so what I want to do is invite you, if you are feeling overwhelmed, uncomfortable, just need to take a moment, to please do. Feel free to stand up, take a break, walk out, et cetera, and come back. And also, there will be many of us here throughout the day, so if you would like to talk, in between, afterwards, et cetera, our contact information is available and will be around throughout the day. So first, we're going to offer just a few definitions so that we are all talking about the same thing today. And we're going to start with this definition of the word adversity. And adversity just means a difficult circumstance or a challenge. It could be in any context. I want to give you the definition of trauma from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and it has three aspects. So the first is that a traumatic experience is something that either threatens us or actually does harm us in any of multiple dimensions: physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, etc. And not just us, it could be somebody that we care about or even somebody that we're witnessing that we don't know. The second piece of it is that this experience overwhelms our ability to cope. So we don't have enough resources, again, in multiple dimensions, to be able to meet the challenges of this experience. And then finally, the last part of trauma is that there is an impact on our function over time, again, across multiple dimensions. So that's trauma. Neuroplasticity is the capacity of our brain in particular to change over time. This capacity is most available to us when we're young, between, again, conception to about age 3, but we have this capacity across the lifespan, and we can use it for good or evil. So we want to think about how we use our capacity to change our brains for good. And then finally, I want to define this idea of resilience, which is part of our conference title. So resilience simply means the ability to bounce back. And what we really want to focus on and emphasize is that we're all born with the capacity to bounce back, but we don't know how to do it until we are supported and offered skills to practice to build that capacity. So it's nobody's fault if they're not resilient. It just means that they haven't had those supports and that instruction to be able to develop that capacity. And what we'll also learn is that if we're exposed to difficult, adverse, traumatic experiences in childhood without enough buffering, we tend to have more sensitivity and less flexibility. But again, this is malleable. We're not stuck with that. We just need to be aware. So I want to bring the focus to us before we get into the students and the families that we're working with. So teachers, unfortunately, even though they are, the bedrock of the future of the nation, have come under lots of attack, and I don't need to tell you guys that, you know that intimately. But what we also need to be aware of is that teachers, like other human service professionals, doctors, firemen, policemen, nurses, etc., we all actually have a fairly significant history of our own traumatic experience growing up. And that's because we're human beings, and we're going to see that pretty much across the world, this statistic is the case. So many of us come into our work with a history of traumatic experience, and we're called to our work because we really want to process this for ourselves and transform it for others. As I said, there's been really a national scapegoating and abuse of teachers. And then certainly we hear lots of painful stories in our work, within our social networks, when we turn on the television or the radio. And this has an impact on us too. It's called secondary trauma. So it's not something that's happening directly to us, but because we're social animals, we respond to the feelings and pain of others. And so we want to be aware of our own history and figure out ways for ourselves and connect to others who can support us around processing that. We want to think about how we create a force field around ourselves so that we can be empathic to others without taking in the trauma of others. And then we want to really set ourselves up to be able to avoid burnout while we're working on our own recovery and while we're doing our work. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. In fact, there's a whole session today about how we do that for ourselves. So I want to just start with, are these familiar, and how are they connected? That's part of what we're going to talk about. So we see on the left, there is a little boy who is doing a million things and can't really figure out which one he is going to do, and he's fidgety, and I know that you see that in your classrooms all the time. We have another little boy on your right who has asthma, so we'll just use that as kind of a moniker for chronic disease. On the bottom, I know many of you struggle often with students who either don't seem to be, they're struggling to master the material, or they're not doing their work, something like that. And then the bottom picture is of two colleagues screaming at each other. And so I know that we see both among our students and among our faculty and staff, there is often conflict. And so what I'd like you to sort of keep in mind, the question that we're going to be beginning to answer is, how are these things connected to each other? And what do we need to do about it so that we can both prevent and then kind of mitigate or treat these kinds of scenarios. So we're going to start with a research study that's about 20 years old. It's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This was a study that was done in California. It was a large public health study of about 17,000 people in a health maintenance organization. These people were mostly white and Hispanic. The average age was 57, although the ages spanned from 19 to 80. People were employed and insured, and they lived in San Diego, California. What the researchers looked at was, first they looked at what was the rate of 10 categories of abuse, neglect, and household stress. And the things that fell under the household stress were things like a family member who had been incarcerated, or who had a mental illness, or who had an addiction. They also looked at the connection, the relationship between these 10 categories of adversity and outcomes: physical health, mental health, and social well-being. And what they found really was staggering, although if you go back in the literature, people had found this out before and we had forgotten it. So what they found is this. First, they found that these 10 experiences were extremely common, that almost 2/3 of the people who had participated in the study had at least one of these experiences, and up to 6% had more than 6 of these experiences. They found that people who had one of these experiences were highly likely to have more than one. And they found that the more of these experiences that people had, the more likely they were to have physical health problems, mental health problems, and social problems, both at work, in school, and in relationships. And so these experiences are profoundly impactful on our health and well-being in adulthood. They asked people about these experiences in childhood, from birth to age 18. Something that is really kind of chilling is that people who had 6 or more of these 10 experiences were at higher risk of dying up to 20 years early than the general population. Now, you might be saying, well, this is interesting, but like, this is one population of, white folks in California. What should we think about that? Well, this work has been replicated across the country, and in fact, in many countries around the world, in diverse populations. So many different races and ethnicities, special populations like homeless population, incarcerated populations. Even we have statistics here in Illinois and here in Chicago as well. And what we find is that, just like with teachers, and human service professionals, about 60 to 80%, depending on the population, have had at least one of these experiences, and probably about a quarter have had 3 or more. So this is significant for experiences that happen inside the family and to individuals. Well, over this past 20 years, people have said, well, this is not the universe of adversity. There are other things that have an impact on people's lives, like poverty, like being in the child welfare system, like racism, etc. And it turns out that we see the same kinds of associations with those experiences as well. And so all of these experiences have an impact on our health and well-being, again, from childhood all the way through. Let's take a kind of a quick look at the educational space. So people have also looked at, again, these 10 categories, although really we could expand them, and said, what impact does this have in schools? Well, it has a huge impact. In fact, these experiences of childhood adversity are the greatest single predictor for health, for attendance, and for behavior. So if we're not thinking about them when we are trying to design our attendance policies or thinking about behavior in the classroom, we're really missing what is behind the curtain. And we're missing an avenue towards effective strategies. They're the second strongest predictor after special education status for academic failure. And what I would argue is that they actually are at the root of special education status in many situations. So very, very important in terms of academic success. The relationship between the relationship between academic achievement and health status appears much less related to income than to childhood adversity. And so one of the things in terms of looking across populations is that folks with high incomes also have about the same rate of childhood adversity as people in lower income populations. However, the stress of low income and the stress of discrimination are additional layers of distress that people must contend with. And that's really what this slide is about. So we have those 10 categories of abuse, neglect, and household stress that happen in families, but we also have experiences that people have in communities and in structures, which is what we were just talking about. And finally, across time, war, genocide, slavery, Holocaust, all of those things actually exert an impact. And most people have experiences in more than one of these layers. And so we really want to think about the context across these intersecting places and also time. So just to kind of summarize about the adverse childhood experiences and really a bigger idea of what adversity is, that childhood adversity can have lasting effects on health, so multiple chronic diseases, asthma, heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, really 6 out of the 10 leading causes of death and things beyond that. Also on things that we talk about as behaviors, but I think really are our attempts at soothing ourselves, so smoking, drinking, using drugs, high-risk sexual behavior, gambling, shopping, etc. And then finally, our life potential. So our academic success, our graduation rates, lost time from work, ability to get along with others. They have a big, big impact on our health and well-being. Now, that said, they're not, of course, the only experiences that we have. We have positive experiences too. And it turns out if we have enough of those positive experiences, it really helps to move the needle and to protect us from the challenges that we face. And particularly if we have these positive experiences early on, so that our mothers are well cared for while we are in utero, and they and their partners are well supported in the first years of life, it makes a big, big difference in terms of protecting us. Now, that's not to say that if we live through an earthquake or, God forbid, we're raped at some point in time in our childhood or even in adulthood, that it's not going to have an impact on us. But we're going to be better able to weather those kinds of experiences. So we saw that there's a connection between adversity in childhood and health and well-being, but why is that? So during that same period of time, those same 20 years after the ACE study was done, there was just an explosion of neuroscience research, and we're going to just dip our toe in the water of that. And we're going to talk about the brain and how it grows and develops. So just to ground ourselves, we want to just think about the brain as a an organ of 3 parts. It has many more parts, but for our purposes, we're gonna think about these 3. So the first is the brainstem, the lowest part of the brain. And that part of the brain is very critical in making sure that we stay alive. And it governs things like our heart rate, our breathing, our blood pressure, a little bit of our temperature stability, sleep, etc. But these are really the survival needs. And this part of our brain says, are we safe or not? The middle part of the brain governs our emotions and also is involved in memory and reward and some other things. And this part of the brain is really interested in the questions, am I loved and do I belong? Because of course, back in the day when we were more dependent on each other, although I would argue we're still dependent on each other, but more dependent on each other to, survive that tiger attack or find food or whatever, we had to know whether we belonged in this tribe or not, because we weren't safe if we didn't. Finally, the top part of the brain is the thinking part of the brain, and that's the part that we use in school most of the time. That part of the brain makes judgments, decisions, thinks, is creative. The brain develops from the bottom up, and it develops in response to experiences, particularly early on, those caregiving experiences that are part of our attachment relationships, usually with our moms, but really could be whoever is the primary caregiver. The basis of attachment happens in those early years between 0 and 3. However, we have the opportunity to support attachment relationships in school, because of course kids aren't done when they get to us. And so we can be those adults that help to continue the growth and development of the brain by being caring, loving, creating a safe, and here we go, and attuned, in other words, a responsive relationship with kids. So in addition to developing and functioning from the bottom up, the brain, we say, is a use-dependent organism. So in other words, what it's exposed to helps it to build the kind of synapses, connections, neurons, systems that it needs to be able to respond to what's out there. So when we have an experience out there, our senses perceive the experience and send the information up to our brains. And the first stop is the brainstem. And so the brainstem says about the information, can I survive related to this information, or do I have to do something different? If the answer is, this is not going to affect my survival, the information goes to the middle part of the brain that asks, does this information have anything to do with whether I'm loved or whether I belong? If not, information can get up to the cortex where we can solve that math problem, write that essay, not beat up our sister or somebody like that. But if not, if that information is threatening our survival, or if it raises a question about whether we're loved or whether we belong, that information is never going to get up to our thinking brain. And so there's no math problem or essay or a science test. We're stuck trying to figure out either our survival or our connection with others. So the other thing that I know you know, but we have to tell this to doctors all the time, the brain and the body are connected to each other. And so the brain sends signals to itself up and down, and it sends signals out to the body. And one of the ways that it does that is through the stress response system. And the stress response system is online when we're born, but is fragile, is vulnerable. So depending on what it experiences, it can either grow into a flexible stress response system, or it can grow into a sensitized stress response system. And so what we wanted to do again is to support our moms and our families so that the context in which children are living allows them to develop a flexible stress response system. And we also want those grown-ups to have a flexible stress response system so that they can help their children regulate, because of course this is underdeveloped and children cannot regulate themselves. They really can't totally regulate themselves when they come to us at school. So our jobs as adults are to do what we need to do to stay in the zone, which I'm going to show you in a minute, and to help them stay in the zone too. When we're in the zone, the signals that we send out to the rest of the body are signals that help us stay healthy. When we're out of the zone, it causes issues and makes us ill. And that's what this is about. So the green is we are able to arouse ourselves when we need to. So in other words, when it's time to wake up in the morning, we can get up, we can get going, we can get to school, we can get to work, we can do our work. And when it's lunchtime, we can relax, and so we can digest our food, we can get along with our friends, etc. And then we can rouse ourselves again. So there's this nice ebb and flow of our activation and our relaxation when we have a flexible stress response system, because we've come from a context of care and safety and co-regulation. But what happens to us and to lots and lots of our kids is if we have been overwhelmed by our experiences, we haven't had enough protection, we haven't had enough co-regulation, we either can get stuck on or stuck on off, or we can, wildly swing between one or the other. And this is often what we see when people are either belligerent, aggressive, or frozen and withdrawn. I'm sure that all of you have people in your classrooms or who you're working with who just seem like they've checked out. They're sweet, they're nice, but they're just not there. And that's another way that we respond to stress, is by disappearing, because that's a way to keep ourselves safe when we don't have other things that we can do. So here's the core story of development, just to review. Our brains are built over time from the bottom up and the inside out. Experience and genes together build brains, and experience can modify gene expression. So experience, really the ticket. All of our development, physical, social, emotional, and cognitive, is inextricably linked. Development is sequential and builds on prior development. Is that stress that is toxic, in other words, stress that overwhelms our ability to cope, derails our optimal development. And finally, that our securely attached relationships and co-regulation help to build healthy brains, and those are the brains that can think and learn and get along and do the things that they were put on this earth to do. So just, again, another review from the ACE piece all the way through the neurobiology is that trauma, which overwhelms our protective factors, actually causes our brain to get dysregulated. And this is really the root of all the problems that we're talking about. It's also the opportunity for prevention and the place where we can design our most effective strategies and treatment. And why this happens is that the dysregulated brain actually causes inflammation in the brain and in the body, and just abnormal signaling inside the brain and between the brain and the body and back. And this is at the root of all of the issues that we are facing: disease, inequity, school problems, law enforcement, early death, etc. It's a common pathway. And I think this is what's critical for us to keep in mind is about what we need to do. Oh, sorry. There we go. Okay, so we're going to go back to our brain. So how do we use what we know about the brain to design effective strategies? So we're going to start at the bottom, just like brain development. So we're going to say, what needs to happen for us to be able to survive? And in fact, Maslow sets us up for that. So first we need to make sure that everybody's basic needs are attended to. So as you all know, we and our students cannot work, learn if we're hungry, if we don't have a house, if we're in danger, etc. So we need to figure out, and not you, the individual teacher, but our schools and our school system and our city, how do we make sure that every single person who lives here has their basic needs met? And then this we actually can have some power over, and that is, how do we make our classrooms and our schools places where people feel safe and where they feel like they're loved and where they belong. And so we want to start with ourselves in terms of our basic needs. And we also want to create with our colleagues and with our administrators and with our parents a sense of love and belonging and social network, so that we can continue to do our work and survive and thrive, and so that our students and families do too. So what might this look like? First, we're going to master that science, both the epidemiology, so in other words, the description of the connections, and the neurobiology, what's going on behind the curtain. We're going to support and practice regulation, so things that help the brainstem kind of chug along in a zone where it's not worried about surviving. And that's what we did before we started. We want to create safe spaces, both physically and emotionally. We want to strengthen relationships by building a sense of trust and connection. We want to have predictable classrooms because, of course, the unpredictable and the new is scary, even if it's good. So we want to have routines. We want to have power with our students instead of power over them. When we see things that we like or that we don't like, we want to say, I wonder what that means. We want to stay curious. And then finally, we want to avoid punishment, period, but we certainly want to avoid punishment for trauma symptoms. So just to go through the 6 R's of regulation, activities that are regulating are rhythmic, repetitive, rewarding, relational, relevant, and respectful. And if you think about the activity that we did this morning, it actually meets a lot of these criteria, and all of these things are. So this teacher is getting down to the level, has eye contact with his student, he's smiling, he's co-regulating this child. The child next to him is doing what we did, meditating, doing a mindful activity, journaling, writing, so that expressive writing that Mashari was talking about, that has regulatory components and also helps with integration. And then any obviously rhythmic activity, dancing, singing, playing music and ensemble, if we do it together, it's even better. So just to put it all together, childhood experiences are a powerful, and I would argue the most powerful determinant of development, learning, behavior, and health across the lifespan. If we don't have enough protective factors, or if they're absent, adversity and trauma actually get into our bodies, and they can derail our optimal processes. And so finally, we can actually use this science when we master it to regulate and relate, and so we can reason and we can thrive, and we can really have the schools and the world that we're hoping for. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tali.
Thank you, Audrey, for that fantastic introduction. I have been asked to stand on the stage so people in the back can see, not because I want to be up here. But I am going to really take a minute to talk about frameworks for building trauma-informed schools. So the reason it's important to talk about frameworks is because what Audrey did is really eloquently tell us about the kind of so what. Why do we need to care about trauma in schools? Why does it matter? How does it work? What is the impact of it? But today we really want to move to the now what stage. What do we do with this information? What does it mean in practice? So frameworks are not the most exciting thing to talk about, right? But if you don't know where you're going, you might wind up someplace else, right? So we need to have some roadmap for where are we actually going with this. So let me just do a quick poll. How many of you in this room have heard of the term trauma-informed or trauma-responsive schools? Yay. Now, I'm going to ask you a second question. How many of you, if someone kind of put you on the spot, put a microphone in your hand, how many of you could actually say succinctly in 1 to 2 sentences, what does that mean in practice? Okay, right, so way fewer. Some of you maybe. Hopefully by the end of this day, you'll be able, a lot more of you would raise your hand to that question, because the frameworks are important to tell us kind of where are we going? How did we get there, right? So what I'd like to do is just start for 1 second with a tiny little interactive poll. So you get to pull out your phones, if you don't have them out already, and we're gonna ask you to text the number 2233 and text the words Lurie CCR. I probably should have mentioned who I am and where I'm from. My name is Talia Ravi. I'm a clinical psychologist from Lurie Children's Center for Childhood Resilience, and that's why the password here is Lurie CCR. And in one word, we're going to ask you to just text one word about your vision for a trauma-informed school. Okay, so we're going to ask you to just text your vision, and then we'll see this come up here in a word cloud once you've done that. So once you text the number 2233 and write the word Lurie CCR, you should get a little confirmation. And then you'll be prompted to text your word. Okay, so you've got stuff coming up. So as the words get bigger, that means more people have said them. So I'm seeing safe really coming out, healing, compassionate, restorative, empowering, relationships, collaborative, universal, joyful. All right. So here's our vision for the day from you all, right? So here's where we want to go today. So safe, healing, restorative, understanding, justice I see in there. So this is fantastic. Thank you all for texting in your responses. We will have a picture of this beautiful slide that you guys made available for everybody. And that'll continue to go up. So I'm going to just talk briefly, because I don't want to take time away from our panel, about a couple different frameworks that are out there. One framework that I think helps us with this idea, this vision, is the whole school, whole community, whole child framework. This is issued from the Center for Disease Control, and it's really talking about how do we incorporate health and wellness with education. So this is a lot about what Audrey was talking about as our, pediatrician, right? Family doctor, right? Health and wellness are related to educational achievement. Healthy brains learn better, right? So this framework puts the child in the center and talks about wanting kids to be healthy, safe, challenged, supported, engaged, but it's a community effort. And so a big theme for our day today is how do we all community collaborate together to provide health and wellness for our students. Some of you, hopefully many of you have heard about the framework that came out of SAMHSA, which talks about kind of these 4 R's. So we love 5 R's, 6 R's, 4 S's, 3 E's. We love all these acronyms, but basically this is kind of the overall what we're trying to get. We're trying to have frameworks and systems in schools that realize the impact of trauma, right, and how prevalent it is. That's today. That's kind of that first piece, that awareness, that recognizes the trauma signs and symptoms when we see them and recognize that that's what they are. That's what Sherry was talking about in terms of the aggression can be a trauma response. Responding by integrating that knowledge about trauma into all facets of the system, and then resist re-traumatization. So we want to heal and not cause further damage to our students. So this is a great guiding framework. What I'm really excited about, and if you haven't seen this, in 2017, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network issued a framework that had these 10 components that really spelled out what does this look like in the school setting. We will put this on our conference website so that you can have access to this framework, but it really talks about these 10 components, and I'm not going to go into them in a lot of detail, but what is really helpful is that that framework really divides it up into the MTSS system that all educators are really familiar with. What do we do at Tier 1? Universally, prevention for everyone. What do we do at Tier 2 for those who just need a little bit more? And then what do we do at Tier 3 for those who really need individualized or more intensive intervention? So some of the things that are on here, I'm not going to highlight all 10 of these aspects, but I'm going to highlight some of them that I think are particularly relevant for today. So this is talking about really the treatment of traumatic stress. I'm a clinical psychologist, and so we'll have a session for those of you who are mental health professionals. One of the breakout sessions is about what do we do from a mental health perspective. But we know that many people here, or most people here, are not therapists. So there's lots that you can do to be therapeutic without being a therapist. So we're talking about trauma awareness and education in our schools. How do we advocate for that if it hasn't happened already? We're talking about how do we create a trauma-informed learning environment? What are some specific things that we're doing in the classroom that can really promote that? And we have some sessions this afternoon about that, and some schools that are going to talk about their journey and how they're doing that. Cultural responsiveness is really throughout our day. We really need to think about this as a social justice issue, that we cannot disentangle the effects of inequities in our system from trauma, that those are really related concepts, especially in our city. Staff self-care. So we have some fantastic folks doing a presentation this afternoon, because if we are not our best selves, if we are impacted by our work in a way that makes us drained, then we cannot give to others. Michael Meyer and some other people are going to do a couple sessions this afternoon about restorative practices, and I saw restorative come up in our word cloud. How do we bring restorative disciplinary practices and disrupt that school to prison pipeline? If you see in that cartoon, how do we make that happen? And then what we really hope to launch today is this idea that we cannot do this alone. A single teacher in a school cannot do this alone. A single school can't do this alone. This is really about cross-system collaboration and the kind of whole community coming around the child. So I think in kind of just closing, before I turn it over to our fantastic panel, I'd like to just say that a few goals for today. Starting from the really kind of basic and simple, I hope you make a connection. And that connection could be with someone that you're here with, someone you meet, a connection about a particular student you work with, kind of connecting those dots, but make a connection. We hope that you will leave here learning something that is immediately actionable, that you can do when you walk out of here. And my husband, who's a teacher, who's actually also in the audience, always says it's not a good PD unless he walks out with something that he can actually do in his classroom tomorrow. We hope you have something like that today. Renew your commitment to this work and to your students and to our communities. Envision what's possible, and let's engage in some solution-oriented conversations. We hope there will be time for lots of that kind of thing today. So thank you. We're really excited for our fantastic panel. I'm going to give them to Michael to introduce them, and we're really excited that you all joined us here today. Thanks so much.
And while our panel makes their way up, while Sheila, Saad, Octavia, and Crystal come up to the stage, I have one more housekeeping item to point out. We are offering Illinois State Board of Education credits for teachers in the crowd. So if you're able to get credits, just be sure to sign the sign-in sheets at the back table. Carmen, say hello. Sign the sign-in sheets for the ISB credits. And so stay tuned. We're going to have another panel before we break, and we'll advance our conversation by speaking with folks who are trying to walk the talk and put things into action. So let's hear about your work. If you want to introduce yourselves, tell us what you're up to and what you're seeing.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Sheila Barlow, the principal of Powell Academy. I'm actually, for those teachers who are out here, I'm actually the principal of the same school that I was a teacher in. And so I was a teacher at Powell back in the late 90s, and then returning as the principal So I'm very familiar with the South Shore community, and I'll probably talk more about my experience in South Shore as we go through what came about with us having being a trap school.
Hi, everyone. I am Octavia Tyson from the Department of Public Health in the Office of Violence Prevention. So a lot of the work that we do is looking at how do we take trauma-informed and really respond to the public health issue that it is, and looking at that from a kind of ecological model, so whole systems approach, whole communities approach, and we do a lot of work in both the faith sector as well as with the schools and from the community, and then with the systems. Good morning, friends. My name is Crystal Winfield Edwards, and currently I am supporting the district's option schools, and I'm seeing some wonderful things as our option schools really take a mindset shift towards more trauma-informed supports and really building out a true MTSS framework that will support our district's most vulnerable students.
Hello. Okay, now I have 3 microphones. My name is Sana Lewis. I am not a teacher. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm none of those things. I don't even have a degree. But I am a community organizer. I am a lover, a fighter, a continuous learner. I'm a part of Kumalink's Hip Hop Arts Organization, which focuses on restorative justice through a hip hop lens and pedagogy. I'm a part of BYP 100, which is Black Youth Project, which focuses on social liberation of Black and brown folks through a Black queer feminist lens. And I'm also a part of Good Kids Mad City, which focuses on gun violence and gun prevention, mainly on the south and west sides of Chicago. And so those are my nightlife. For a job, I work for Public Allies, and it's basically a job that places you at another job. And I work for a SPARK program, which is a mentorship program for 7th and 8th grade students, as well as mentoring 8th grade girls. And so while I don't have degrees or I'm not a teacher, I do come from a long line of teacher, and I do consider myself an educator and a lover of all things. Not all things, so.
For all our panelists, got some fantastic women here. Thinking of trauma responsiveness in schools in particular, like a recipe, what would you say are some of the ingredients that we need to really build the recipe? What needs to be in place for a school to be trauma responsive?
100 people like her. I am not doing nearly everything that she is doing at all. But when we think about what those active ingredients are, it really does start with a mindset shift of us really being able to recognize what the real true needs are that our students are having, and how trauma affects itself, not just in our school, but also in our communities, in our homes, recognizing that our children really are true offsprings of their parents, and even being trauma sensitive when our parents come in, because some of the things that we recognize is that our students and our parents are often mimicking the same behaviors. And that tells us a lot. That tells us that our parents are also stuck sometimes in the same places that our children are. And so part of that active ingredient is that we have to have some compassion and empathy, and definitely start off with a true mindset shift of understanding that our thinking has to change and what our approach is to how we actually do and implement education.
I was gonna say, one of the approaches that we took was looking at our CIWP. My instructional leadership team worked on the CIWP, and so one of the things that kept staring at us was SEL. The teachers kept saying, we need SEL support. And so when I presented the CIWP to my chief, she kept saying, well, you got all this SEL stuff going on. Like, when are you gonna talk to the core, which is instruction? And I kept pushing back as to say the core, in order for the teachers to be successful, is that they have to have that SEL support. And so we can't get to the instruction until we have the SEL support. So we looked at it from 2 layers. We looked at it, well, really 3. We looked at it from building a team, and we call them the Treppers. And so we didn't just look at teachers that were that had great classroom management and great relationships. We took it from both. And so what we did at the end, when we did a survey, another survey, what would you like to see more of? And they kept saying SEL. So over the summer, we worked with the University of Chicago. We created this team, which was a mixture. We had primary, intermediate, upper. We also had our specialist teachers because we knew that students were saying, or teachers were saying, it's the specialist teachers. And the specialist teachers were saying, it's the gen ed teachers. And so we knew that we had to create this dynamic team. And then after creating this team, we knew that we had to implement it with the staff. So those were some key pieces that we needed to do as a school. And it was great that it tied back to what teachers were asking for and what we knew that our students were also asking for.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with both of those. I had to ask questions to understand what SEL was. Some of these acronyms are very new to me. And so one of the first things that needs to happen is start asking questions. But also, she talked about something like generational trauma and being super well informed that some of the things that happen are from a long line in history and systemic issues that cause us to experience forms of trauma that are not always easy to spot and see. I think one of the biggest things that we need to start with is understanding that this model and all of this information in terms of our brain development and our brain function is only a basis. We cannot adequately implement all of this information if we don't understand that this is systemic. And that we can do this stuff in the classrooms, we can do this stuff in the schools, but ultimately you're going to be sending them back into environments that are harsh and dangerous and putting them back in that fight or flight response. And we also have to talk about how sometimes it's not even outside of the school. Sometimes it's the policing within our schools. Black and brown youth are very heavily policed day in and day out. And so when you go to school and you're going to classrooms and you close your eyes and doing this mindful techniques and you go outside and you see a security guard body slam somebody, of course that's going to go out the window. And so I think we need to start being very mindful and very understanding of the fact that this is only one part of a bigger picture, and that in order to fully and sustainably create change, we have to fix systemic issues.
And I think too, in adding to that, there are a couple of things that I think are a part of the key ingredients. One is that trauma-informed or trauma awareness and trauma sensitive is not an intervention. It is a culture change, it is a mind shift. And so you can't think of it as what I need to do for the students all the time. We have to stop and look within ourselves first. So we don't start fixing ourselves and thinking about ourselves as a system, as individuals and how we show up. We will just continue to kind of re-traumatize and kind of keep adding into the culture that creates all of the things that we start to see. The other part of this is that, unfortunately, because it is a culture change and a culture shift, a lot of this work goes unfunded. And that we know that you get taxed with more duties and more hats to wear and more changes and more shifts, depending on what's out there and what's trending. And so part of that too, in thinking about sustainability, is who can you be able to wrap around and who can you be able to connect with to be able to support the work that you are doing. We know that schools can work in schools, and so we need people to work in communities that are connected to schools, and people who can work in communities that are connected to faith and the medical groups. And so I think that's important to think about what really will partnerships look like in this in order for it to be systemic.
I want to piggyback off what Octavia was saying about restorative practices in particular, but this all being a culture at a school. It's not a curriculum or a program or a room where this is done. So for all of us, if you reflect on something cultural, your own culture, that you enjoy, if it's a dish, if it's a tradition, if it's a ritual that you all do with your family, think who taught it to you. Where did you learn that? Usually you trace it back to mom or grandma, but it's your elders. And the thing about shifting the culture and restorative practices at a school is it takes the grown-ups, the adults, the elders, to embrace it, to teach it, and to pass it on to the young people. We can't expect our young people to do it in the classroom if we're not embracing it ourselves. And I think that's where our leadership needs to look at the soft influence of power, the soft power of influence of their leadership roles, if it's a principal, et cetera. There's also your sanctioned power of authority for decision-making in a principal position, but there's also your soft power of influence, where you can really embrace a culture and set the tone for everyone in the school. But carrying on our conversation with the recipe, what would you say are some of the steps or processes unfolding this, getting everyone on board and shifting that mindset?
Well, first, I think it starts with understanding our own trauma. I think that was very much said and very much important. Of course, you can't help anybody else if you haven't helped yourself. And it's very much difficult to sit in somebody's face and say, well, it's gonna get better, and you don't even believe it. So I'd say that that's the very, very first step. The second step would be to get this information and really take it, internalize it, process it, and practice it in your everyday life. And so now that you understand that you have this trauma, you understand where you're coming from, you understand how to notice the signs and notice the things that are coming up in your life that may, project your trauma onto other people. Because I think we often project our trauma onto a lot of students or youth. It's very important that we take that time to really understand ourselves. The second thing is that we need to stop thinking that youth are not adequately able to regulate themselves. I'm 18 years old, so I fall in this bracket of underdeveloped age and where my brain is still processing. And that's 100% true. But I've been organizing since I was 13 years old. And so for me, people are sitting in my face and saying, well, you don't know any better. You don't know what's good for you. How do you know? You're traumatized. And to think that we look at our youth in such a narrow lens is one of the big bases and big reasons why this stuff doesn't work. Thank you. I think that we really need to start considering and start including youth in these conversations. We think that these words are super eloquent and super big, and how are we going to get them to pay attention? It's hard. Trust me, I have 7th graders who look at me like I'm crazy all the time, but we need to start looking at them in a sense that they will have an understanding of this information and they will be able to handle what it is that is going on. And I think it's also important to understand that just because you've experienced trauma does not necessarily mean that you're traumatized. And so we also can't look at this information and start going into our classrooms and saying every person with a bad mood is experiencing trauma, because that's definitely not true. Our experiences have a immensely large impact on who we are as people. So I could have gotten into a car accident, and while that may have been traumatic for Michael, it wasn't traumatic for me. And so we can't go into these classrooms and think that, oh my God, you poor little child, you're so traumatized. Let me help you. Because not everybody is traumatized. And I also think third step would be implementing restorative justice. So I'm talking a lot, cut it down. But there's all these different steps of like acknowledging yourself, understanding where you fall and what your role is, and also understanding that we have so much to learn from youth and so much to learn from young people, and then also understanding that we need to start taking adequate steps to implement understanding our emotions, and that starts with restorative justice. So I'm a certified circle keeper, and so I can hold circles, I can hold peace circles, healing circles, and all these different steps and tools to give students in order to understand their emotions. But the key part that people forget about restorative justice is how do you repair the harm that's been done? And so a lot of times students are experiencing trauma and experiencing these large sums of emotions. We get them in these circles, and then we think that excludes them from holding them accountable for the actions and the trauma that they've caused and inflicted on another person. No, you have to include some sort of repair. How you've done this, you've experienced this, I'm sorry that you're experiencing this, but how can you learn from it? How can you heal from it? How can you show that what you've done to another person is not something that you want to continue to do? And so those are probably like the 3 big things that I would put out there.
so loving her right now. Like she could be my daughter. Let me be your godmama. You asked such a wonderful loaded question. And I'll just speak from my perspective of being trained from the Office of School Turnaround. My first experience with CPS was that of the Office of School Turnaround. They were very intentional and they were also consistent. But in their quest for intentionality, they were very specific about their hiring practices. They wanted to make sure that everyone that came in the building was coming in with the mindset of collaboration. So you were literally being weeded out. If you sat at that table during that group interview and they felt like your eyebrows weren't right and you weren't able to interact with people with a smile, they were looking at that and they were saying thank you and goodbye. They wanted a certain type of mindset in the building. And so that even starts with our administrators. Take a hard look at who it is that you're hiring. You know if that person is mean. You know whether or not they're going to greet your students with a smile. I had an all-star check-in list when I was working at Harper High School, and I would have 30 students that signed in on my book every day. And all they came for was for me to say, hey, good morning, dear heart. How are you? Come back and see me later in the middle of the lunch day. Just want to make sure you're doing all right. It wasn't that I needed to do intentional therapy with them. They just wanted a smile. We have to build out environments that are so intentionally safe that our kids are running into the school to come and see you because they know that when they get to you, they are going to feel safe. You don't have to be a therapist to be able to implement safety with a student. You just have to be consistent. I had a young woman I worked with, and my goodness, she couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, but I'm telling you, she could fight, right? I loved her. She was my friend. Now, she told me it was going to be her birthday, and she was in foster care. I said, I promise you I'm going to buy you some lotion, because she liked my lotion I had on my desk. So midday on her birthday, she comes limping in half of a uniform shirt and jeans. I say, what happened to you, dear heart? She said, 4 girls jumped me, but it's my birthday and you told me you were going to bring me some lotion. Midday, she came for the lotion. Now, could you imagine if I had not had that lotion? What if I didn't have it? And you all just had some very wonderful PD about how we're rebuilding experiences for children and really making sure that we reshape their schemas with just being consistent. Consistency. So if you already know that you're having that bad day, don't bring that to a kid. Don't call. She said, please don't, it was her. If you know that you're still in the moment and you just had a very challenging behavioral moment with a student, do the best that you can to not take that behavior personally, but really truly understand that that is that student's only learned way of expressing their behavior. But instead, go give them an emotional word wheel and ask them, what was the emotion that you experienced? What was the feeling that you experienced? Let's really talk about that so that way I can really help you to define what it is that what's happening with you so that you and I can have a consistent relationship. And yes, I've been called a B before. It was some things that were said to me that I would not ever believe. But I had to deal with that, and I was just like, we still all right. But it starts with a mindset and consistency. It starts with really for your leaderships, really looking at that multi-tier system of support and building out shared leadership intentionally. Making sure that your MTSS menus of interventions aren't just all academics. Because if my mind isn't there, I will never write an essay for you. What you're going to get from me is, I hate this, I hate you, you make me sick, my mama make me sick, and why am I even doing this? And there will be explicits, because we know our kids know how to spell cuss words. But it's about our mindset. It's about who we are when we present ourselves to our students. And just like this young lady said, she doesn't want us coming to her with our eyebrows and me saying, oh, you know what, my husband got on my nerve last night. What you want? No. She doesn't deserve that. She deserves the very best of you. Our kids deserve the very best of you. That's what they're showing up for. And that's part of what it starts at. I don't know how I have to follow these two for my structured academic approach to. So I'll just take from kind of the public health model and what we've done, because we're doing an internal trauma-informed transformation. Again, working on us first before we go out and work on others. And the three things I say is to know, build, and do. And that sounds very simple, but what we often do is do first, then we start making backward steps. And so all of you probably have been through training, but when we raised our hands and we said, who all knows strategies, the room was pretty dense on the number of hands raised. And that's because we often do training without knowing what we're really doing. And not knowing just definitions, but what are we doing? Are we talking about creating community engaged environments? Are we talking about just reduction in student referrals to discipline? Like, what are we really doing? What's the plan? And so you have to start with first doing kind of that assessment and knowing first what the culture and climate is, and then seeing the holes and the gaps and where you can build. Also seeing your internal strengths as well that are within the school and the organization. You do that first, you do the assessment, and then you kind of build off of that. So you figure out then what partners you need to have in the room, what environmental changes need to take place, what funding you need to be able to do some of this work, and then what training and what other opportunities are needed as you begin to build. And then you can start doing all the actual work. But if we don't have a lens of how we do the work and what we're defining as trauma-informed or trauma-aware, then we'll just all be all over the place and we won't really have a path that we're going down to get us there. So that's what I say is my three, is just kind of know, build, and do. I think Chris, we talked a lot about how you begin to do those things. We have a whole trauma-informed transformation plan that I'm happy to share with everyone as well, that you can be able to look at it, how we built it out.
So we took it from the lens. So we took it from the lens, and I think this was mentioned earlier with our staff. And so we knew that in order to roll this out and to be culturally aware, that we had to really look at our teachers and our support staff and see if this was a happy environment. And so my team came together, and so they basically laid out for the year, like what would be some of the celebrations. So they said, in order to have a happy staff, what does that plan look like? And so if you come to POW, you'll see the teachers' doors are decorated for their birthdays and just really celebrating the teachers, even in our correspondence each week, and moving in that direction. The other piece, and I know there was mention around MTSS, we knew how to do MTSS 1, but we knew that our MTSS 3 children were the ones who were the neediest. And so we had adopted Panther. And so our team came up with that. And so what it meant was we looked at our most challenging students. And so we looked at our staff members, and each staff member had to adopt a child. And so it was like, if we're really going to do this, we all need to adopt a child. And so I have 65 staff members. And so, of course, being the principal, they gave me the most challenging child that I had to adopt, because I had wanted to unadopt him a couple of times. But I kept saying, but his adoption papers are in my office. And so I signed it, he signed it, whatever. And my adopted child, Darrell McKenzie, he is on track. He's a 7th grader. And so one of the things that I had to do was to make sure that his 7th grade scores, his 7th grade grades would not stop him from being able to have selective enrollment options and to be successful. My child who I adopted was actually, he saw his father was killed right in front of him when he was at the age of 4. And so as a school principal, if I didn't acknowledge that, or if I did not feel that this is something that I needed to do differently, or if I said, you know what, this is child number 1, this is child number 2, this is child number 3, I would not be the principal that I am now. And so I say that as to say that we as educators, we have to realize that everybody has a story. And so even when I talk to my students, I was like, what's your story? And so when I say that, I'm really trying to get out of them, what is it that you feel, what was important to you at that particular time? So I believe that as a school, you have to not only think about your students, but also think about your staff, and then who are the team members that are going to be that push. But then also making sure that there are deliverables so that as a school, you can come back and measure if it was successful. Because I'm gonna brag about Darrell. You know, I wanted to take his adoption papers and cut it up. But I could not do that because I knew that I had an African-American boy who, if I didn't do something different, his story would be a different story. And so I charge you, even as educators, to make sure that you're looking into your students and recognizing that sometimes we have to do something different. Because as a teacher and as a principal, it's almost like you want everybody to come in and just be, as we call it, be pantherific. We want everybody to come in every day to be pantherific, and we know that that's not our reality.
When Asada was speaking to the difficulty of the accountability piece, working with students who are acting out, and we do some processing, we put in some supports, but hitting the accountability is still a difficult thing. An experience came to mind of working with some 5th grade girls at Kilmer Elementary, where they were all friends, but something went wrong, and I couldn't even tell you what went wrong. They were all telling me at the same time. But this 5th grade girl is my new teacher on accountability. She was calling out a friend saying, you started being mean to us, and I don't know why. You were saying things to other people, you're giving us looks, you're saying things to us, and I need to know why. And the girl she was speaking to and confronting just starts crying quietly. And this 5th grade girl actually gets up out of the circle, walks over, she puts her arm around her friend that she's confronting. She says it's okay to cry, it's okay to have feelings, and it's okay to not know what to say sometimes. But I need an answer. What? I need to answer my question. And the adults in the room on the behavioral health team later learned that young girls' trauma history. Compounded trauma on top of trauma. And we know how desperately she needs a friend at this moment in her life. And so we're trying to figure out how to get those supports in place for her, how to maintain healthy relationships, but we also need to uphold her accountability to her friends for her behavior. That's how she needs to fit in and belong. They need to call her out, it needs to be addressed. So we're still figuring out that one. And that to me also highlights how messy this can be. You know, these slides they're polished, they're nice, and the concepts seem pretty clear, but when you're live with students, it can get really complicated and hairy quickly. And we're scrambling, we're improvising, we're trying to lean back on our training and our knowledge, but it can be, you sit with a lot of uncertainty when you're with these students. But to further our conversation, what else? What should be on our radar? What should be highlighted? What do you think needs to be talked about that isn't being talked about or addressed quite enough? What's part of the picture when it comes to trauma responsiveness?
I was going to say being proactive. As I said, my school is in South Shore. About a year ago, we had, I don't know if it was on the news, we had 3 gentlemen that were killed maybe less than a half block from our school. And so this occurred about 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes before we were dismissing our students. So the shooting takes place, parents are running into the building, we're dismissing about close to 600 kids. And so the police hadn't even got there. We're talking about bodies in the streets, not knowing, you know, it's almost like it was a panic. And so we're trying to block the corner off because we got students coming from different angles and we're not really knowing what's really going on. Like, is the shooting still occurring? What really happened? And so we're trying to block off every possible street that the children could go down, and we got parents running because they don't know what's happening. But as a school, we didn't really have a plan. So it was like the next day, the parents are looking at me and saying, what are you gonna do about it? How are you, like the kids, you know, we're trying to say, please don't go that way, please don't go that way. But they have, you know, it was like one person they found later who had run from the scene, but ended up, passing about a half a block. So they didn't even know about this person. So it's just like the kids that may have walked past and see this body that's in the street. And so I say this as to say, like, be proactive, because as a school, we weren't. And I felt like as a school and as a school district, how do we make sure that we handle this? And so right now we have that team in place, but I felt like as a principal that we were being more reactive versus being proactive. Know your community, know your surroundings. And as a principal, I'm always, whenever there's a shooting in South Shore, I'm always looking to see where it was in terms of proximity to the school. So I think that's a huge piece, and making sure that don't just brush it off as to say the kids, you know, would see that any day or every day, because that is traumatic for them. It was traumatic for us even as a school. And so those are things that I would say, just as a school, be more proactive.
I would say, going back to my three E's or 33s. So I think that one is that accountability for a truly healed and healing organization and system, accountability is a part of that. And so trauma-informed is not without accountability. Trauma-informed is not rainbows, unicorns, sunshine. So trauma-informed is not, you know, rainbows, unicorns, and sunshines and all those things, right? You will get frustrated. You will become impatient with it, and be okay to know that failure is an expectation in this, and that we have to acknowledge that and address that and be able to pivot when needed and learn from that, because it's a learning process. Our systems didn't get this way overnight. It was a learned cultural process that took generations for us to get to this broken place that we were in. So that's one. The second part is that, in thinking about that, epigenetics shows that not only do we have our markers from our ancestors and our past that contributes to our trauma, that contributes to how we respond in a dysregulated way, but also those things can be stopped. So the generational transmission can be prevented when we have more enriched lives, when we have more peaceful and healing environments. And so we have to really think about that, and how do we get there? The last part is that we don't get there just by our students alone. And we have to be really careful and not just working on our students and forgetting about our parents, forgetting about their caregivers, and forgetting about all the other environments that they interact with on a daily basis, including you. That includes that bus ride to get to work, right? And so what the department really encourages and what we really want to put out there is a whole system approach to how we're doing things. And you can't just do one piece over here and then I leave over here and I'm completely traumatized, or I'm completely in an environment that's nothing but consequences for me. That doesn't really create the loop, and it doesn't stop that transgenerational trauma or trans-community trauma that we start to experience and feel. So I really would encourage us to think about that, because it's often left out, is how do we do a whole systems approach to that.
So I have a whole lot that I'm gonna try to get this in. I really am not for sure exactly what the universities are doing in their teacher preparation programs to really ensure that teachers are prepared to enter into urban school environments, especially those that are extremely high need, so that you can have an expectation, right? So that you can know what to expect. When I did my MSW, and even when I did my Master of Education, especially my Master of Education, it did not include teaching me about how to respond to trauma in schools. And with that being said, I really think that we need to begin to advocate with our teacher preparation programs. And I'm not judging anybody, just in case if I'm being recorded. I'm not judging you. I'm just asking if you could please look into that. Thank you. And with that being said, it's critical because you're walking in and you don't understand what the signs of suicide are. You don't understand that when you see a significantly disruptive behavior, it makes you afraid. And you don't know what to do, and the social worker isn't there every day. So we need to make sure that our teachers are prepared, right? Our social workers are prepared. We need some more money. Anybody listening? Can we have some more money, please? Just for the program, so especially when we start talking about restorative practices, right? I can come in and when I do a professional development with my schools and I ask everybody and say, hey, y'all ready to take a mindset shift with me? And they look at me and I say, yes, this is going to be difficult and it's going to be painful because I'm asking you to change the way that you think and respond. But a one-stop shop of me doing a PD, we need people on the ground, right? And we're able to do that in some schools, but if this is really what we're doing, every school should be doing it so that way, when our kids get on the street, instead of saying, you know what, hold on, wait, I'll be back. I'm going to get my brother, he gonna shoot you. It's like, when I went to school, I felt this way and it made me feel vulnerable and I didn't like the way that felt. If we really truly implement restorative practices for real, we can decrease gun violence. Now, I'm not a doctor or a PhD or anything like that, but I truly believe that if we teach our kids true executive functioning, true communication skills, we can do that, right? Also, it also begins with me recognizing who I am as a person in the environment. One year I got sent over to Washington High School, right? So here I am, Black woman. I don't speak Spanish. Yeah, and they did. Thank God my intern spoke some Spanish, right? So I was like, come on over here with me. We have to make this happen. But I needed to acknowledge the fact that I was a Black woman in your environment. However, I'm still here to help, and that does not decrease my capacity or my desire to help you. And despite language barrier, I had a mother translate to me. She said, you are one of the first people that has really understood what our true need is. And this is even with the language barrier, that despite whatever the racial barriers are, your compassion can come through. It does not matter. Your race does not have to match up with your student for them to know that you care about them. They just want you to be consistent. They want you to be non-judgmental with them. They want you to be able to be embracing with them. And when we talk about building out trauma-sensitive schools, it really is first about safety. That when I get to the school, I don't have to worry about being verbally abused. That if I try to ask a question from the lunchroom lady to the custodian, nobody's gonna look at me and be like, get away from me. That's really happening. It happened to my son. And I said, ma'am, he does not have to be near you. Oh, I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to him. Now we're going to walk over to your principal because we need to find out why it is that you're speaking to 6-year-olds like this. Especially mine. So now here comes this historical trauma coming back, right? Because I just forgot that I have 3 degrees and I turned into his mama. Right? So then I had to relax my eyebrows back again. And I needed to remember, and I needed to take this teacher in consideration. I don't know what her day has been like, and I don't know what her training was. So those are things that I'm going to take in consideration. If you feel like there's a gap for you, especially in social emotional learning, say, you know what, go to your principal and say, we need our network social emotional learning specialists to come out and teach us what it is that they know. Make sure, ask your principals, is SEL in your CIWP? Ask to see the CIWP. And if it's not, find yourself a way to figure out how to get it in there, right? Look at what your multi-tier systems of support are and dig deep into that framework and find out who your community partners are and find out whether or not, is this a community partner that comes to my school once a year? So what's gonna happen once a year? You say nothing. I saw you shake your head, friend. Yes, you said nothing. What's going to happen if I give you a one-stop shop? Nothing. Because our kids need consistency. And if we're really, truly going to be trauma-informed and trauma-responsive, we have to be consistent. The squeaky wheel is what? The oil. So I need you all to be oil. Thank you for being oil.
Wow, that's my godmom, y'all. But no, in all seriousness, women of color are the reason why I am the way I am, the reason why I am on this stage. People of color who are in education are the reason why I can sit on this stage and speak the things that I speak. I graduated at 16 years old, very early. I come from a long line of teachers, dad, grandma, grandpa, uncle, aunt. And so I just want to commend you guys and truly uplift the role that you all have within your students' lives. That's first. Second of all, I just want to say that y'all have a lot of patience. This was my first year working with youth in a different capacity than I normally do. So normally I'm a mentor, a youth facilitator at Cool Leagues. And so I have a lot more freedom to engage with youth in a different way. And what I'm noticing is that teachers do not have that same freedom and flexibility to do what they need to do. And so that's extremely difficult to navigate and to figure out how to make everything work when not everything works. I would say that I had so much resentment for teachers, but now I love y'all. I really, 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 really do. I call my mom every Friday and call her, I'm like, these 7th graders are not listening to me. I don't know what to do. And she's just like, she revels in it and she takes so much love in hearing me struggle. And I'm just like, thanks, Mom. You've been very helpful. But besides all that backstory, I completely agree with what everybody on this panel has said. Consistency is definitely key. I will say that I did not have a lot of consistent teachers in my life, and that affected me and impacted me in a lot of numerous ways. These community partners that we partner with, we need to start holding them accountable for consistency and allowing them to be consistent in our spaces. And so a lot of times when I'm in these school settings and I'm going into these schools and I'm not a teacher, there's no relationship between me and the teachers. There's no relationship between me and the principal. There's no relationship between me and the custodian workers. And so it's a lot of times, a lot of running around and trying to figure out what could have been communicated between me and the teacher. I only see the students twice a week, less than that, if anything. And so I cannot understand everything that might have happened up until the next Tuesday that I see them. I think that community partners play a big key role in youth development and the way that they come into the school. So a lot of times after school programs are the safe haven for a lot of these students, are the places that they go to in order to get off the street, in order to express themselves. I'm an artist, so I do poetry, I do music, I have a play out, all of that. And so if I didn't have these things, I don't know where I would be. If I didn't have these people, I don't know where I would be. But in saying all that, like with community partners, there's also a lot of things happening outside your schools that affect your youth. And so No Cop Academy, building a $95 million cop academy when y'all don't got money, that we know that's some things that needs to be fixed and some things that need to talk about. But yeah, when I go into schools, I don't hear anybody talking about it. I don't hear anybody advocating or talking about it to their students and saying, this is what's going on. Do you think this is right? What would you do with $95 million? Tell me, because they would tell you what they would do with $95 million. They built basketball courts, they opened up their own restaurants, they built their own schools, they do a lot. And so I think that we need to start having open dialogue about the things that affect our youth the most. And so also addressing the gang database within our systems. Youth are constantly being put on a gang database that they cannot get off of. A lot of your youth are on a gang database that they cannot get off of. Let's talk about that. Let's acknowledge the fact that these youth will be criminalized and penalized before they even leave high school, before they even get to high school. That's ridiculous, right? And so we need to start being a lot more transparent and clear about the systems that create adversities for our students. And so we can not only talk about the trauma that comes from it, but we have to talk and be transparent about what is causing it. What is the systemic root and issue that is causing you to not have any grocery stores near your house? What is the systemic issue that is causing you to think that seeing somebody get shot is normal? I think a lot of our students have become desensitized to violence and harm. And so when we talk about trauma, a lot of them don't even know that they're experiencing trauma. I didn't know I was experiencing trauma until I had the trainings that you guys are about to take, until I sat in a classroom and talked about these things. These students are being traumatized and don't even have the language or understanding that they are experiencing something that is not normal. I think social media also highlights and like puts it on a big screen, the amount of violence, like seeing people get shot on Instagram and on Facebook also is not normal. And so I think that we need to start really thinking about the ways in which our students are experiencing adverse struggle in environments outside of school settings. And how can we partner with other organizations and community partners that specifically focus on these issues? I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. A lot of teachers aren't therapists or psychologists. And so you can't do it all by yourself. Nobody can do it all by themselves. And that's why we have each other. And that's why we have a family. I consider everybody in Chicago my family. If you're in Chicago and you root for the Sox, right? I'm a Sox fan. And so it's just very, 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 very vital and very important that we really start to look and take a hard look at the city of Chicago. We just elected a mayor whose first thing when she got elected was to turn all these closed down schools into police training academies. We need to start addressing the fact that police within school systems cause trauma and cause harm. They gotta get out, period. We need to start advocating and really partnering again with these community organizations because we want y'all to have money too. Like, my dad's a teacher, he's broke. I know. My grandma's a teacher, they're broke. I know. So we need to get some more money for our school systems, and we need to have therapists in replacement of these police officers. So again, in understanding that we have boundaries for ourselves, and we have boundaries that we don't want to re-traumatize ourselves as well. We need to have licensed clinical therapists within schools who can handle this trauma that we cannot. We cannot. Period. Sorry, my age is coming out, but period. All this to say that there are an abundance of solutions on how to be trauma-informed, how to deal with adverse situations, how to care and be compassionate and equitable and empathetic towards our youth. And this is the reason why we have these conferences, in these panels, in these public discussions, in these PDs, in these CTCs, in these 3Rs and 3Js and all the other acronyms and things that we have. We have these to continue the conversation on what a just and equitable world looks like, not only in education, but in this world. What do we want for our youth? What do we want for the next generation? And how are we going to get it for them? And how are we including them in the conversation around what is going to be happening to them? These conversations cannot just stay in this room at all. They need to be taken to your 8th graders, your 7th graders, your freshmen, your juniors, your sophomores, and you need to ask them what they want and what they need to be successful. What do they know what they want and what they need to be successful. If you think they don't, you're lying to yourself, period. Yeah, so got passionate, sorry. Much love, peace, all that.
One more thing that came to mind for me on that advocacy piece is when I was running the peace room at Robeson High School, we would do a peace rally once a year. We'd take it to the streets with our signs and drums and say no more violence. I didn't have any illusions that our march was going to stop a lot of bullets. Those students really noticed what teachers showed up for that. So if we are trying to help their sense of safety, they saw who they could trust there, and they really remember who was showing up for them in that way. There's a Lilla Watson quote. She says, "If you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. If you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, let's work together." So I think some positive partnerships came out of those peace rallies, those peace marches, not just students to teachers, but students and neighbors. People were honking and waving in support. The kids had no idea anyone else cared about violence. They had no idea. And just speaking to Asada's leaning into the arts and all that she's doing, I got to know about Paul Robeson a little bit while I was at Paul Robeson High School. And he said artists are the gatekeepers of truth. They're civilization's radical voice. So if we're talking about trauma, if we're talking about things that are unspeakable, it makes sense to lean into the arts to tell our story. process non-verbally through the arts. And I think it'd be fitting to close with words from another wonderful woman of color, Maya Angelou, because someone was saying we need to be okay with failing a little bit. And I'm hoping that everybody leaves here today ready to start failing. And I say that understanding that there's no failure, there's only feedback. And that we can brush off the bitterness of failure and take in the lessons that we can learn from our failures. But Maya Angelou said, in life there are many defeats, but we must never be defeated. We need to keep showing up for our young people. So thank you to our panelists.
Actually, can I close out in this, another way? You know, I'm a part of Coma Links, and so we always open and close the space with this, and so if everybody can repeat after me, peace, love, respect, for myself, peace, love, respect, for everybody, paz, amor, respeto, para todos, ashe, ashe, ashe. Thank you.
We're gonna take a short break while our next panel comes up to the stage. We're gonna hear voices from the field, people who are on the ground doing the work from different schools around the area. Take care of yourselves, be back in 10 minutes. We'll continue our conversation.